As we continue our series on China-Africa relations, today we're going to discuss a new book, The Political Economy of China's Infrastructure Development in Africa, Capital, State, Agency, and Debt. This book was written by Dr. Tim Zajontz. It was published by Palgrave Macmillan and can be accessed on the link that I'm going to paste right in the description panel on the upload for this video. Dr. Tim, thank you very much for making the time. I should say good morning. Is it good morning your side or it's good afternoon?
It is good afternoon. Yes.
Nice. You are very welcome to the show. I was looking forward to having you. I have yet about 4 authors who have written about China-Africa relations, and this makes you the 5th person to appear on the show to talk about this. So I'm very much looking forward to an interesting interview. Before we get to start to talk about the book, I just want you to tell me and to tell our audience, who is Dr. Tim and what do you do?
Thank you very much, Anatida. Thanks for having me. First of all, I as I said before, I've been following your series for quite some time, and I feel truly honored for the invitation and for having the opportunity to speak about my book. So, who is Dr. Tim Zajontz? I'm currently a lecturer in global political economy and international relations at the University of Freiburg in Germany. I'm also a research fellow in the Center for International and Comparative Politics at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. And Stellenbosch University is actually also my alma mater, where I did my master's degree some winters ago. After my master's at Stellenbosch, I actually went into practice. So I worked for a few years for the European Union in Brussels, and then I embarked on PhD studies at the School of International Relations in St Andrews in Scotland. And this is also where I pursued research that actually eventually contributed to the book that we will be discussing. This was research again on China's engagement in African infrastructure markets, and my PhD was supervised by the late Professor Ian Taylor, who some of the listeners and certainly you might know, who has been quite an influential voice in this epistemic field of China-Africa studies.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. Thank you very much for that. So now, what would you say are the core ideas of the book, and what is its central argument?
I guess the book's subtitle basically alludes to the main themes that are covered in the book. The subtitle reads Capital, State Agency, Debt. So the term capital comes from a research interest to basically identify some of the economic drivers behind China's rise as the main financier and builder of infrastructure across the African continent. Throughout the 2010s, it became increasingly clear that the Chinese state, as well as state-owned companies, but also private Chinese firms, had started to engage in a major reorganization of the Chinese growth model, and part of this economic policy, of this spatial reorganization of the Chinese growth model was the export of surplus capital, not least in the infrastructure and construction sectors, and this became sort of central to the effort of reorganizing China's economy and also outward investments. And in 2013, as we all know, what can be called the second going out phase of Chinese capital got a brand, which is obviously the well-known Belt and Road Initiative, which since has become both the material but also the superstructural centerpiece of China's engagement with the world, certainly in the economic sector, but as we know, not only in the economic sector, it is political cooperation, it is cultural cooperation, person-to-person exchanges, as it is very often called. So this is sort of the research interest that was there in China's foreign policy, and particularly in China's economic policy, and this to try to document and to understand this trend of Chinese capital being invested in infrastructure ventures on the African continent. And simultaneously with this trend, and actually not only confined in the infrastructure sector, we had experienced a growing body of literature, but also of public debates, political debates in African capitals and elsewhere about the role of African actors, be they governments, businesses, civil society actors, or regional organization, their role in basically shaping their country's relations with the superpower China, if we want to call it that. So this tendency in the literature was once called by Chris Alden and Daniel Large. It was once called the African agency turn in China-Africa studies. So I found it intriguing to further unpack and also to conceptualize and theorize the notion of African agency, and to assess the extent and the different ways how African actors have actually been able to shape the negotiations, the design, the implementation, and also the governance of infrastructure projects with Chinese participation. So this idea is represented by the term state agency in the title of or in the subtitle of the book, even though the book does not suggest that at all, that only state actors have a say in Sino-African infrastructural encounters. And lastly, the third theme that is central to the book is one that has been highly politicized starting in the mid-2010s, and further then sort of discursively exploited when this term of the so-called debt trap diplomacy in inverted commas was coined in 2017, I believe. So the book tries to offer a more nuanced understanding of basically of the function of debt in the context of Chinese-funded infrastructure projects in Africa, but also more widely the function of debt in global capitalism generally. So over the years, there have been very laudable research efforts, for instance, by the China-Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins University, which has tried and actually succeeded to bring the discussion about Chinese-owned African debt back onto a factual basis, for instance, by providing better data on Chinese loan commitments to Africa. This has very much helped to put Chinese loans into perspective. It has also exposed the hypocrisy of the West, which has obviously over the last decades continued to be involved in loan finance towards Africa as well, and has particularly private investors have also gambled and extended credit to African governments. So this research has helped a lot, but at the same time, my book tries to go beyond the description of the problem and tries to conceptualize and also tries to provide a critical political economy of that debt issue. So in some ways, again, it tries to conceptualize the function of debt within global capital accumulation. So in summary, the book combines literature, both theoretical and empirical, as well as a lot of primary data from research stays in Tanzania and Zambia to shed light on these three interlinked themes. Chinese surplus capital that has been moved into African infrastructure markets, the agency of a diverse and very dynamic set of African actors, which are officially and in some cases also informally involved in Chinese infrastructure projects. And finally, the problem of infrastructure debt, which evidently haunts several African societies to this day.
That is wonderful. So I understand that your book is part of Palgrave Macmillan's International Political Economy series that is actually currently being edited by Timothy Shaw. What would you say are the major or is the major contribution of your work to the conventional discourses of China-Africa relations?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, as you know, the Palgrave's International Political Economy series, it has quite a long tradition, and it has featured many very influential titles on a wide variety of developments and topics within the research tradition of global political economy. So this IPE series that you referred to has always had a particular focus on the so-called Global South, and many of its contributions are informed by rather heterodox and critical theoretical approaches and perspectives, and also by multidisciplinary approaches. So in this sense, my book actually adds to this long-standing scholarship within that particular series. There's, for example, also Filani Mtembu's book from the series on China and India's development cooperation in Africa, which was published in this series. And there are several very insightful titles on the BRICS countries' influence globally and relations with Africa, and not even though it is not part of the IPE series, I think you had Bob Wekesa, Professor Wekesa, on your show, which was also a Palgrave published book on China's footprint in East Africa. So in many ways, I add to this debate or complement this debate in a few regards. I do believe one contribution I believe is that the book is very theory informed. The reason might be that it obviously is the result of PhD research, which is usually very, very much theory informed. But at the same time, it also tries to build theory. So it's also theory building in a sense, because for a very long time, this epistemic subfield of China-Africa studies has actually been suffering from under-theorization, if we can call it like that. Over the last years, we have seen some sophisticated theoretical works with focus on specific dimensions of Africa-China relations. The African agency turn that I just mentioned is one case in point, and there's also intriguing contributions from geographers, urban studies scholars, sociologists, and other fields. Yet I believe the book, at least to my knowledge, is the first book-length attempt to theorize Sino-African cooperation in the infrastructure realm by combining rather general assumptions about the geography of capitalism with more specific agency-focused approaches and investigations. So the ambition was actually to enhance our theoretical understanding of how Chinese capital, most of it actually state capital, and a myriad of African actors interact in a very dynamic and densely structured subdomain of the economy, notably infrastructure. And it is, again, some of the theoretical propositions that I make in the book, especially the strategic-relational approach to the study of China-Africa relations, which I propose. I think these are this approach has prevented me from falling into either of two theoretical traps that have been reproduced in both popular debates about China-Africa, but also a lot of the gray literature and some academic literature. The one trap that I try to avoid through the theory or the theoretical framework that I propose is an overly structuralist interpretation of growing Chinese interests in African infrastructure markets, which would suggest that China's economic prowess and its geopolitical influence might allow China to actually dictate the terms of these projects. At the same time, I also do criticize some scholarship which has, in my view, all too simplistically pushed back on such structuralist arguments. The argument here, or my argument here, is that not everything that African state actors or non-state actors are doing in their relations with Chinese actors necessarily amounts to agency. We must rather understand and study African actors in Sino-African relations within their specific set of structural constraints, which either enable or can also constrain them in their efforts to influence their relations in line with their interests and strategies. So I think this is one major contribution where I potentially add to some of this very intriguing literature that I have mentioned. And if you allow me to add one last point, which I mentioned briefly already, the book actually offers a more critical understanding of the function of sovereign debt, which, as I said, is integral to global processes and cycles of capital accumulation, and very much to the disadvantage of African societies. Sovereign debt has prolonged Africa's financial dependency on foreign capital, be it Western or Chinese capital or foreign capital from elsewhere. As I do argue in the book, debt, just like capital, is a social relation, and it is a social relation which is marked by asymmetric material relations, which do imply certain power differentials between debtor and lender.
I saw that you have a chapter on Zambia, you have a chapter on Tanzania. What would you say are the major differences between China's engagement with the Southern African countries that you studied and other parts of the continent? In other words, what is it that explains the focus on Zambia and Tanzania?
I do believe that Chinese relations or any other external actors' relations with any African country and society are necessarily always specific, and they depend on particular historical path dependencies, on cultural specifics, and of course on political and economic circumstances, which obviously across the continent differ significantly. Yes, there are certain general characteristics that can reasonably be argued to apply to China-Africa relations across the board. If we think, for instance, about the fact that China has become a major, if not the main trading partner for almost all countries on the African continent, there's also the shared experience of Western colonialism and imperialism, which to this day characterizes China's engagement with all African countries in some ways. But then again, there are also crucial differences, or maybe better, particularities in China's bilateral relations with African states, economies and societies. So Tanzania and Zambia have certainly enjoyed a special relationship with China. Actually, that term, the all-weather friendship, which is sometimes used to describe China-Africa relations generally, it actually emerged in the historical context of China's relations with newly independent Tanzania and Zambia. And this term again suggests already that there are kind of special ties between Tanzania and Zambia on the one hand side and China on the other hand side. As you, as a historian and most listeners would know, China supported and aided Tanzania and Zambia in the construction of the Tanzania-Zambia Railway in the early 1970s, and this cooperation happened actually, after several Western states, also Western private firms and various development banks had actually declined to finance an alternative railway route to make Zambia less dependent on transport routes through racist Rhodesia and apartheid South Africa. It was in the context of this decolonizing infrastructure project that ties between China and Tanzania and Zambia intensified across a variety of fields and spheres. So the TAZARA, as this railway is called, became in some ways the cornerstone for more comprehensive political, diplomatic, also inter-party relations between the political parties in those three countries, but also economic relations, cultural exchanges, etc. And in an edited volume on Africa's railway renaissance, which I co-edited with Porrick Carmody and Mandira Bhagwandeen from the UCT and Anthony Lasons from Stellenbosch University, our colleague Professor Liu Haifang, who is at the Center of African Studies at Beijing University, she actually nicely demonstrate in a chapter in that book that I just mentioned that this cooperation, this historical cooperation in the context of the TAZARA and what Professor Liu calls the TAZARA spirit, that this has actually a lasting impact to this day. It has been very formative for all kinds of engagements and exchanges between China and Africa and those countries in particular, but it still continues to inform policy and certainly the discourse of Chinese officials, but also of African officials, and also the memories of a lot of Tanzanians and Zambians and Chinese from this period in time. So for my research in the political economy of Sino-African cooperation in the infrastructure sector, I considered both Tanzania and Zambia in some ways as critical cases in a methodological sense. I expected that these cases do provide critical insights into both theoretical and empirical terms, considering this long-standing cooperation that had been established between the three countries. And the fact that Chinese involvement in TAZARA, in this railway, dates back some 50 years also allowed me to assess Chinese engagements in financing and building infrastructure over time. Clearly, the construction of the Tanzania-Zambia Railway took place in a very distinct historical and geopolitical context during Southern Africa's struggle for liberation and independence from colonial regimes. And so does contemporary cooperation in the infrastructure sector. So I considered it intriguing to find out more about certain continuities, but also clearly certain discontinuities in China's in the way how China invests in African infrastructure and how China is involved in the infrastructure sector in these countries. And then there were additional reasons why I chose to study Tanzania and Zambia. For one, Tanzania has been considered a central hub within China's Belt and Road Initiative. Chinese President Xi Jinping visited Tanzania in 2013, and back then he agreed with his Tanzanian counterpart at the time, President Kikwete. They agreed on a major multi-billion investment in a mega port and special economic zone in Bagamoyo, north of Dar es Salaam. Initially, China was also heavily involved in Tanzania's new standard gauge railway. At least they Chinese companies bid to get the project. And this situation actually changed rather abruptly with coming into the office of Tanzania's President Magufuli in 2015. Magufuli was had been elected on an election platform which was markedly informed by what one can call economic nationalism, and he was outspokenly skeptical about the distribution of costs and benefits of foreign investments in the Tanzanian economy. So the Tanzanian case offered a very intriguing case study to assess the degree and also the forms of African agency in determining Chinese-funded or implemented infrastructure projects. And for the Zambian part, cooperation had actually significantly intensified in the infrastructure sector as Zambia had opened up the economy significantly already throughout the 1990s and 2000s. So we had early on Chinese investments in Zambia's mining sector, but then throughout the 2010s, we had economic policies decided in Lusaka, which amounted to what I call in the book a development through infrastructure agenda. What do I mean by that? The Zambian government at the time believed that more investments in infrastructure and also debt-financed investment in infrastructure would actually create spillovers into other economic sectors. So they did come up with specific projects, for instance, in the road sector, to rehabilitate a large number of roads across the country. So infrastructure became key within Zambia's own economic policy making, and in many ways China stood ready, both Chinese banks but also Chinese construction companies stood ready to actually support the Zambian government in their efforts and in their what I call development through infrastructure agenda. So particularly Zambia's road sector became another relevant specific case study for me to look at, to investigate the political economy of Chinese infrastructure projects. And perhaps very briefly, because you also asked to what extent actually China's engagement with Zambia and Tanzania might differ from China's engagement with other countries in Southern Africa. As I mentioned before, a lot depends on context and on path dependencies of previous relations with China, and also it depends largely on the structure of the economies in Southern Africa. Some of them being minerals rich, others having, for instance, a more diversified economy, such as South Africa. So it is very difficult to have a general conclusion on that question. Again, it depends on context, and in many ways, as you know much better than I do, because you are from the region. I'm only an outside observer of the region. These contexts, political context, economic context, and also institutional context, they differ quite a bit across the region. And actually, my book, with reference to these two concrete case studies, it shows that these contexts have a huge impact on the nature of Sino-African relations.
That's interesting. So now, briefly, as we close, what is your conclusion? What would you say are the major highlights that any reader, if he is to get hold of your book, would be interesting insight.
Considering that the book has 330 pages,
yes.
it might not be very easy to come up with an overall conclusion. But let me try it nonetheless, or let me carve out a few, what could be called a few main findings of my study. I guess one conclusion, which is of course not rocket science at all, is that there is no easy verdict as to whether China's rise to become an infrastructure giant across Africa has been a good or a bad thing. It's the conclusion, or this verdict here, is rather, it depends. And as I mentioned already, it depends on very much on African agency, on what institutional political contexts there are, and also what economic contexts there are. If we, for instance, consider Zambia's debt crisis that it has experienced, this has significantly impacted the degree of agency that Lusaka had in their relations with China. And the book has identified some of these political, economic, and institutional parameters in the governance of Chinese funded or built infrastructure that crucially determine to what extent African actors can shape the outcomes of such infrastructure projects. So again, for instance, we have seen that in the Zambian case, that informal institutions and practices and governance practices within the Zambian state apparatus throughout the 2010s, that they have caused an acceleration of what I call the Chinese infrastructural fix in Zambia. So more and more road projects, for instance, were signed at the time without much concern actually about the sustainability of debt these projects would incur. There's also been a number of actors within the state apparatus in Zambia with close ties to high officials who have profited from what I call not so public procurement. In other words, they made a lot of money from the inflow of Chinese capital into Zambia's infrastructure sector. In many cases, they made that money legally, but in some cases, allegedly also illicitly. So this is basically the findings around governance, and institutions and politics do matter in determining the costs and benefits of Chinese-funded infrastructure projects. The Tanzanian case has shown a different picture. Here again, the African agency that was exerted by the Magufuli administration at the time actually caused Chinese infrastructure investments to significantly decrease. In many ways, Magufuli's autocratic economic nationalism resulted in a reassessment of costs and benefits of several proposed infrastructure projects in the country, and this meant also that the mega port in Bagamoyo was, for instance, shelved. So far, it hasn't been implemented. And also the intended privatization of the Tanzania-Zambia Railway, which I had mentioned, was rejected under Magufuli, and the conditions that were proposed by a Chinese consortium at the time were rejected. So the conclusion here being that African agency does matter, yet it matters differentially. It depends very much on specific state forms, on institutional and political context, and to make things yet more complex, these contexts are not static, but they change. So we have seen since the incoming of new administrations, both in Dodoma and Tanzania and in Lusaka, we have seen that these governments now again have new approaches how to deal with debt, for instance, in the case of Zambia, but also, for instance, President Samia Hassan in Tanzania, she's now again much more open for Chinese investments across the board, including in infrastructure. And to finalize, perhaps one other main finding this book, I believe, documents is that increasingly unsustainable levels of infrastructure debt in some African countries has resulted in a gradual shift in the financial governance of China's Belt and Road Initiative. What do I mean by that? We are now seeing a growing number of public-private partnerships in the infrastructure sector with Chinese participation. And this obviously means that formerly public services and infrastructure assets are now being privatized and commodified. And in some ways, again, speaking to a historian like yourself, we are experiencing a situation that is reminiscent of Africa's debt crisis in the 1980s, actually, when privatization and austerity policies are unfortunately back on the political agenda in various African capitals. And lastly, I mean, the political economy of China's infrastructure development in Africa, and this is something that I also discuss both in the introduction, but then also in the conclusion in the book of the book and throughout various chapters, is the geopolitical context that is, as you know quite well, is rapidly changing as well. We have now increased interest on the part of the US, but also the European Union and other actors such as Japan, such as India, such as South Korea, to get involved in constructing African infrastructure. So the book also shows that there is an intensifying competition, and that actually China is now experiencing increased competition from other actors, including the US or the EU, which, for instance, have announced to build or to rehabilitate the railway corridor, the so-called Lobito corridor in Angola, connecting to the southern DRC and Zambia. So we see that China's infrastructure development in Africa will, in the next decade, also be very much influenced by what other actors are doing, both in terms of financing infrastructure, but then also in the context of concrete projects. And unfortunately, this wider geopolitical context, at least in my view, is currently more confrontational, not necessarily complementary. And as you know, some of our colleagues and some scholars would argue that we are sort of experiencing a new form of a Cold War, even though it might have different geographies and different geographic dynamics. I think there's something to be said about this argument, and this will certainly affect China's engagement in Africa in the coming years.
That is excellent. Thank you so much for the time, Dr. Tim. Viewers and listeners, those of you who want to buy a copy of Dr. Tim's book can access it right in the description panel on the upload for this video. Thank you very much, Dr. Tim, and have a good day.
Thank you very much, Aratida. Thank you.
Wonderful.